Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, mission postponed. Don't for a minute think the US debt ceiling problems have gone away. The last-minute extension in Congress might have saved face, but not much else. We look at what happens next in an ongoing political and economic mess in the United States. Also this week, a return to Greece and the possibility that these scenes may be relegated to history. The IMF's now predicting growth for the Greek economy. But is it enough to call it a recovery? And in remote Canada, the Indigenous people finding it's tough to put a meal on the table. We look at rising food costs just below the Arctic Circle. Hello everyone, what a week in US politics and economics it was. And I'll tell you, for this show as well, it's not easy trying to put together a broadcast when you just don't know how something like the US debt crisis is going to pan out. In the end, it panned out, well, all right. The debt ceiling limit was raised, but once again, Republicans and Democrats took it right to the last minute before the US got into dangerous territory with its remaining finances.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
The successful vote in Congress meant the US government finally reopened and federal employees could go back to work. But it was a sticking plaster at best. The deal funds the government until January 15, so there is the spectre of another shutdown in just 3 months' time, and raises the debt ceiling until February 7. So really, this whole scenario of attempted bargaining over American government finances has not gone away at all. And, rather ominously, it looks like the same issue will crop up. In a statement, Republican House Leader John Boehner said our drive to stop the train wreck that is Obama's healthcare law will continue. What was incredible to watch, though, was the differing reactions to this debt deal. See, politicians, despite the complete 11th hour nature of the deal, were very busy patting themselves on the back when it all came through.
I want to thank the leadership for coming together and getting this done. Hopefully next time, it won't be in the 11th hour. One of the things that I said throughout this process is we've got to get out of the habit of governing by crisis.
And my hat's off to Senator Reid for his tremendous work.
Second, I'd like to praise the president.
I appreciate the work that Senator Alexander, Senator Schumer did.
Which is all very nice, but do you think the American people were impressed?
Well, very sad, because they need to get together and get something accomplished. They're like a couple of little kids on a merry-go, on a school ground, bickering and not getting anything done.
It seems like most of the government is playing politics, and it's about political power. It's not about what's good for America, and that frustrates me greatly.
A lot of people discussing, I believe it will happen come the voting, time for voting this next go around. I believe very strongly that a lot of people, a lot of voices will be heard at that time.
But until then, what happens? I want to bring in Paddy Calhay now, Al Jazeera's White House correspondent and someone who I think explains these things better than most. How are you, Paddy?
Good, Kamal. How are you?
Very well. Tell us what actually happens next, because this looks like the classic kick the can down the road territory, doesn't it?
It's been said so much, it's almost as if you can hear clanging all through Washington, D.C. Basically, what they've done is they've given themselves 3 to 4 more months, and they're going to try to come up with some sort of longer budget deficit deal. They've been here before. They've tried this several times. Each time the two sides, basically the talks just, in essence, collapse, and they're right back to another crisis. One thing to keep in mind, during this last crisis, these lawmakers were doing what the base of their party wanted them to do. It wasn't politically tough, but making a long-term budget deal is going to be very challenging for these lawmakers. For the GOP, it's going to have to mean the Republican Party, they're going to have to agree to raise taxes on companies. That's not going to sit well with their base. And for Democrats, they're going to have to agree some sort of entitlement reform. For example, cutting benefits to the elderly, money to the elderly, health care to the poor. It is going to be incredibly politically unpopular, and I don't know if we've seen from these lawmakers the political courage to pull that off.
And what did the Republicans get out of this in the end? Because they wanted, as they called it, a defunding of the Affordable Health Care Act. That was why this went down to the wire, at least one of the reasons why this went so far down to the wire. And yet in the final deal, they didn't get anything like that.
They didn't get anything. And one point that's been lost in all of this, what they tried to do wouldn't have actually stopped the Affordable Care Act because of the way it's funded. They were doing this to tell their base that they were standing up for what their people, their party, the most extreme members of their party were doing. The question is not what these lawmakers that held up the deal learned. The question really is, what did the House Speaker John Boehner learn? If he learned that he can go against the most extreme members of his party, called the Tea Party, and still keep his job and make a deal with Democrats, then he might be more willing to actually make a long-term budget deal. But if the lesson from this is that he has to listen to the most conservative members of his party, well, it looks like we'll be right back here again in 3 months' time.
Patty, let's talk about impact here. I want to forget about politicians. We talk about them too much. From the tangible to the intangible, what has this done to the United States?
Well, it's a huge number, $24 billion. That's what economists say was taken out of the economy. How it's going to affect long-term growth, it's too early to tell. But the intangible is what it's done to the confidence of the American people. Polls show they are overwhelmingly disgusted by what their government is doing. That has an impact because if you ask them, is the country headed in the right direction? It had been going on a good trajectory, and then because of this crisis, it turned on its head. 78% of Americans say the country is now headed in the wrong direction. That has an impact in a consumer-based economy. People then stop spending money, and that can really slow economic growth. There's also the impact on the world standing. President Barack Obama talked about this and said nothing has been more damaging than this crisis over the last couple of weeks to send a message to the world that the U.S. basically doesn't have its act together. And then there's the idea of federal workers. Let's think about this. They were told, and they're going to get back pay, but they didn't know that, and they didn't know how long they were going to be out of work. Now, would you stay on the job if you were told that at any moment, possibly in 3 months, you're just not going to get to go to work and you don't get a paycheck? A lot of these federal workers, these are not very wealthy people. I've spoken to several of them over the last several weeks. They live paycheck to paycheck. Those paychecks didn't come. So now their credit rating's impacted. If you were one of them, would you stay on the job or would you start looking for other work? That's the question. We might not know the answer for a while.
Patty Culhane, lovely to talk to you as always. Thank you so much for that. So with all these political games getting in the way of the bigger picture and, well, the future of the US and global economy, it was a happy coincidence to see a report released at the same time by the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. That is Oxford as in the English University. The commission was chaired by Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization. And earlier in the week, before the debt deal was struck, he joined us from London for a chat. Mr. Lamy, it was one line in the report which really stood out for me, where you talked about the increasing short-termism of modern politics. That is exactly what we've seen in Washington for the past few weeks, isn't it? It is quite fascinating and I think worrying at the same time to see that very destructive nature of politics being played out.
No, you're correct. Had we, when we started the work of this commission a year ago, had to choose a day in order to have this advocacy about more long-term and less short-term, we probably would have chosen the day before the US might go bankrupt. Now, I don't think it will happen, but I think it's a perfect case of the gridlocks of short-termism, brinkmanship, playing chicken, having potentially a deep global long-term effect. And this is one of the problems we're trying to address in making proposals to exit this short-term gridlocks in modern politics.
Yeah, it would almost be funny if it weren't so serious. That's what's kind of stuck with me through this whole thing. The fact that politicians have used, as you called it there, brinkmanship, when in the end it was the everyday people who got affected by all of this.
I mean, you're correct. It's a worrying situation, but it's also the situation we have in areas like climate change, in communicable or non-communicable diseases, which we have on social inequalities, on youth unemployment. A lot of these issues are man-made. And we need the public, civil society, business organization, international organizations to help raising the time horizon of humanity. Otherwise, I mean, this century, which can be the best of centuries ever, can also be the worst of centuries ever if we don't care more about long term.
Let me just ask you one more thing on the debt issue before we look more at the actual Oxford Martin report, because I want your view, you know, as a business and an economic mind. about the potential effects of all of this. I've heard everything from default and market chaos to, don't panic, there's actually a system in place which will stop these sorts of things happening. Really, the US wouldn't allow itself to default, surely.
I think both of your points are true. I think if they were to default, the consequences for the world economy, for developing countries, for the weakest, for the poorest on this planet would be devastating. Which is, by the way, the reason why I personally believe they will not default, because at the end of the day, they will be rational. But there is a tiny, small probability that somebody pushes on the red button at the wrong moment, and this could have enormous consequences. True, I don't think it will happen, but this is not totally guaranteed.
So the report, Mr. Lamy, tell me what you're going to do with it. Will you take it directly to these world bodies and governments? You know, it's an impressive list of names you've got here that working with you. There was Michelle Bachelet, Ariana Huffington, Mo Ibrahim, many more. People who I'm sure are worth listening to. How are you going to get it out there and, take it straight to the people concerned?
Yeah, what we're going to do is take it to public institutions, take it to business circles, take it to civil society. This commission was with people from very different continents, the Chinese planning minister, the Indian minister in charge of digitalization of identity for nothing less than 1.3 billion people on the Indian continent. So a vast experience, a vast knowledge, and at the end of the day, this is in the hands of citizens. And what we try is to provide them with ideas, with concepts, with tools that might help to bridge this sort of short-term, long-term gap, which we believe, and that's where we all agreed at the very beginning of this work, which started a year ago, we believe is potentially dangerous for this planet.
Pascal Lamy, best of luck with your report, because it does all seem to make quite a lot of sense, actually. Thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, we get a first-hand look at how China's trying to fortify its local economy with a trip to the country's biggest trade fair. That's still to come. Now, remember last week we picked through the IMF's World Economic Outlook, which unfortunately wasn't as optimistic as we might have hoped. Well, one country we didn't really look at was Greece, and we've decided this week it's time for a revisit. After all, for a long time, Greece was the word when it came to economic news, rarely out of the headlines, be it for debt problems, anti-government protests, austerity cuts or international bailouts. It's been a tough road. Greece's economy has contracted by a fifth since 2009. But in the second quarter of this year, it actually grew, marginally, at the same time as the Eurozone as a whole clawed its way out of recession. Here's the numbers the IMF put out, just briefly. A projection of minus 4.2% growth this year, so an economy still in contraction. But for 2014, some actual positive growth, just 0.6%, but that is quite an improvement for Greece. However, the IMF also thinks more haircuts, as they're known, budget trims basically, will be needed to pull Greece's debt to GDP ratio down to 124% by the year 2020. Last year, it was 170%. The Greek Deputy Finance Minister Christos Thakouras was certainly upbeat, though, about what would be his country's first annual growth in 6 years.
The citizens have made enormous sacrifices, both in terms of fiscal adjustment and in terms of living standards. However, beginning this year, these sacrifices began to take hold, with the first indications of Greece's exit from the crisis becoming evident.
Let's see what our next guest thinks about that. George Krastas joining us from Athens, a recent PhD at University College in London and a specialist in sovereign funds. George, do you agree that there are some signs now of Greece actually starting to exit this crisis finally?
Well, certainly it's very early to make such an assessment. Now, certainly making inroads into the crisis will depend very much on the performance of the Greek economy. So in other words, it will depend on the progress of the reform program as well as on Greece's future growth prospects. Now, I should mention that Greece is expected to post a positive growth rate for next year, which of course, given the very difficult social and economic environment, is an impressive achievement, as well as Greece is expected also to record a primary surplus this year of roughly 400 to 500 million euros, which again is an enormous step forward and is something that hopefully will be maintained in the future. So overall, Greece has achieved some remarkable outcomes within a very short period of time and inside a very difficult social and economic environment, and this is something that should be recognized.
Okay, then let's break some of this down then, because you've mentioned some of the social and economic reforms which we need to talk about, but also the issue of loans, IMF loans, of course, and we'll come to that. I want to deal with the reforms first. They were tough. We know they were tough. We saw how bad it was on the streets and the unpopularity. In your opinion, have they possibly worked though? Have they done the right thing, all these cutbacks, and can they be justified in some way?
Well, Kamal, the question is, how do we measure the success of austerity? Is it, for instance, Greece exiting the reform program and entering financial markets once again? Or is it establishing a workable governance model for Greece? In my view, it is dependent on Greece maintaining its primary surplus. Now, this, of course, is not the entire picture, as there's the other side of the coin. Naturally, unemployment remains very high, at unsustainable, at dangerous levels, I may say. It currently stands at 27%, and unfortunately there's no prospect of it being reduced dramatically in the near future. Overall, austerity has had very mixed results in Greece. It has offered the incentive, it has incentivized the Greek government to push forward the reform agenda, and naturally we may say it's not necessarily evil as long as it is applied with a purpose and for a very short period of time.
And what about, as you've referred to it, the rescue package, the IMF loans, the famous troika who would come to visit Athens and cast their eye over everything? How has Greece actually kept pace with those loans? Because one of the things which has, always concerned me, looking at these bailouts which Greece took, was that it could actually just add to the burden. It would get them out of immediate default danger, but just delay the inevitable.
Certainly. Well, the Troika mission representing Greece's lenders will be coming back to the country by the end of this month to continue its assessment. Now, previously in July, Greece has managed to secure a loan of 1.7 billion euros, very importantly, without the need for any further austerity measures being implemented in return. Now, Greece is expected overall to face a funding gap of about 4 to 6 billion euros within the next year. And here we're talking about a funding gap in addition to the IMF loan. So the question is, how much of this funding gap will be covered by further austerity measures? Now, in my view, opting for further budget cuts would be a catastrophic scenario, as they would run the risk of destabilizing the Greek government and possibly even forcing it to resort to new elections. With regard to repaying the debt, just to address your question, the final part of your question, you see, the International Monetary Fund has already assumed that a haircut of Greece's debt held by the official sector, such as Greece's Eurozone partners, will be affected in the future, amounting up to possibly 4% of the GDP. I should remind you that Britain repaid its debt to the US from the Second World War as late as 2006. I don't see why not a similar measure could be applied to Greece as well, by, for instance, extending the maturity of its debt to, say, 50 years from now.
George Krastas joining us from Athens this week with an update on Greece's finances. Thank you for that, George. We get a lot of reports on this program which take you to some pretty far-flung places. This week, no exception. It is the far north of Canada, where the indigenous Inuit have got a problem with high food costs. It seems to be the price they pay for living in such beautiful isolation. Daniel Lack sent us this report from Canada's eastern Arctic.
So everybody sleeps in here?
Yes.
Israel Mablik and his young family share a two-bedroom apartment with his mother and sister. Israel's wife doesn't have a job, and his pay has to cover grocery bills that can be several $1,000s a month.
I spend at least 95% of my pay on groceries itself. So because of that, my line of credit is getting bad. My first priority is feeding my kids, my family.
There are no roads connecting this place to the rest of Canada. Everything arrives by air or is shipped on the ocean. And that's why Nunavut has some of the most expensive food in the entire country.
And with those high transport costs, just 2 supermarket chains selling goods across a vast area. Photos posted by shoppers to a Facebook page show cases of fruit juice for $50, a $15 watermelon, and a kilo of beef for around $70. That social media protest soon grew into demonstrations by people who rarely, if ever, had been part of such movements.
When we first started the protest, there was a lot of question, a lot of comments on, this is not the Inuit way. We should, but, if we don't do anything about it, then it's going to be there forever and people are going to keep struggling.
Just below the Arctic Circle, Nunavut is a self-governing Canadian territory run largely by the Inuit. Among the many challenges of living this far north, poverty and malnutrition, as a former nomadic people face the unfamiliarities of a settled life. At this Iqaluit soup kitchen, they're seeing plenty of evidence of that.
This is a hunting culture, and a lot of people are very frustrated with the barriers that have emerged over, the last 30 years or so since the establishment of the settlements that we have today. Now, you're dependent on the local grocery store, and that just brings a whole range of other issues.
For thousands of years, the Inuit gathered food from the land and the ocean. Now, as reluctant townspeople, they're dealing with challenges that their ancestors could hardly have imagined.
Finally this week we're in China, where growth is good, 7.8% for the third quarter, but maybe just not good enough for the perennial powerhouse. See, the key for China going forward is internal consumption, local growth, less reliant on an unreliable global economy. Margaret Rodriguez is in Guangzhou at China's biggest trade fair for a closer look at China's domestic business.
Yes, this is the Canton Trade Fair in Guangzhou, the largest and most significant one in China since its inception in 1957. There are over 25,000 exhibitors selling everything from tiles, home furnishings, IT products, television sets to fairy lights. Now, last year, this place generated business worth $68 billion. But with China opening up, there are more trade fairs of a similar kind in other big cities here. And there's also been a global downturn that basically has meant things around here are changing. The exhibit halls of China's largest trade fair aren't as busy as they used to be. This biannual event in Guangzhou is usually a gauge for how the country's economy is doing. There are less exhibitors this year, and many of them say they expect to make less money.
Business hasn't been too good, but we just have to adjust, make ourselves competitive by adapting to market needs and lowering our costs.
There is little doubt, though, that China's economy is growing. The drop in the country's export figures is reflective of a global slowdown. It comes just as the government is putting economic reforms in place. The current leadership wants to increase domestic consumption and is test-driving new policies in a free trade zone that's just opened in Shanghai. Here, regulations aren't as tight, allowing for freer operations in the service sector, particularly in financial services.
I think the world should believe China is going to follow the standards everyone can accept, and we are trying to move this great economy into this great world, and we are trying to be part of that.
Back at the Canton Trade Fair, it's China's consumption that has attracted some foreign exhibitors to bring in new products.
We feel this market, regardless of the economic situation, there is demand from the affluent community, so we feel there's a big opportunity here in China.
China is indeed getting richer, but the wealth remains in the hands of a few. If the gap in distribution isn't worked out, the widening disparity could force the government to deal with social issues that may bring with them political costs. But the newly installed government under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who took over barely a year ago, seems to be showing the public that it has the strength and the political will to handle sensitive social issues that could lead to bigger problems. Among other things, it's launched an anti-corruption campaign whereby it's even going after politicians to try to make them pay for their alleged crimes. Aside from that, the economic reforms that they're putting in place are meant to encourage small and medium enterprises to thrive and lessen the influence of larger state-owned firms.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/business. The latest business headlines are there. Also, all of our previous episodes for you to catch up on whenever you want. You can get in touch as well. You can tweet me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.